Hey, how are you doing? So, we're going to read part 3 of Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson, My Shore Adventure, chapter 13. How my shore adventure began. The appearance of the island when I came on deck next morning was altogether changed. Although the breeze had now utterly ceased, we had made a great deal of way during the night, and now were lying becalmed about half a mile to the southeast of the low eastern coast. Gray-colored woods covered a large part of the surface. This even tint was indeed broken up by streaks of yellow sandbreak in the lower hands, and by many tall trees of the pine family topping the others, some singly, some in clumps, but the general coloring was uniform and sad. The hills ran up clear above the vegetation in spires of naked rock. All were strangely shaped, and the spyglass, which was by 300 or 400 feet, the tallest on the island, was likewise the strangest in configuration, running up sheer from almost every side, and then suddenly cut off at the top like a pedestal to put a statue on. The Hispaniola was rolling scrubbers under in the ocean swell. The booms were tearing at the blocks. The rudder was banging to and fro, and the whole ship creaking, groaning, and jumping like a manufactory. I had to cling tight to the backstay, and the world turned giddily before my eyes. For though I was a good enough sailor when there was way on, this standing still and being rolled about like a bottle was a thing I never learned to stand without a qualm or so. Above all the morning on an empty stomach. Perhaps it was this. Perhaps it was the look of the island, with its grey, melancholy woods and wild stone spires and surf that we could both see and hear foaming and thundering on the beach step. At last, although the sun shone bright and hot, and the shore birds were fishing and crying all around us, and you would have thought anyone would have been glad to get to land after being so long at sea, my heart sank, as the saying is, into my boots, and from the first look onward, I hated the very thought of Treasure Island. We had a dreary morning's work before us, for there was no sign of any wind, and the boats had to be got out and manned, and the ship warped 3 or 4 miles round the corner of the island, and up the narrow passage to the haven behind Skeleton Island. I volunteered for one of the boats where I had, of course, no business. The heat was sweltering, and the men grumbled fiercely over their work. Anderson was in command of my boat, and instead of keeping the crew in order, he grumbled as loud as the worst. "Whoa," he said with an oath, "it's not forever." I thought this was a very bad sign, for up to that day the men had gone briskly and willingly about their business. But the very sight of the island had relaxed the cords of discipline. All the way in, Long John stood by the steersman and conned the ship. He knew the passage like the palm of his hand, and though the man in chains got everywhere more water than was down in the chart, John never hesitated once. "There's a strong scour with the ebe," he said, "and this here passage has been dug out, in a manner of speaking, with a spade. We brought up just where the anchor was in the chart, about a third of a mile from each shore. The mainland on one side and Skeleton Island on the other. The bottom was clean sand. The plunge of our anchor sent up clouds of birds wheeling and crying over the woods. But in less than a minute they were down again, and all was once more silent. The place was entirely landlocked, buried in the woods. The trees coming down to high water mark, the shores mostly flat, and the hilltops standing round at a distance in a sort of amphitheater. One here, one there, two little rivers, or rather two swamps, emptied out into this pond, as you might call it. And the foliage round that part of the shore had a kind of poisonous brightness. From the ship we could see nothing of the house or stockade, for they were quite buried among trees, and if it had not been for the chart on the companion, we might have been the first that had ever anchored there since the island arose out of the sea. There was not a breath of air moving, nor a sound but that of the surf booming half a mile away along the beaches and against the rocks outside. A peculiar stagnant smell hung over the anchorage, a smell of sodden leaves and rotting tree trunks. I observed the doctor sniffing and sniffing, like someone tasting a bad egg. "I don't know about treasure," he said, "but I'll stake my wig there's a fever here." If the conduct of the men had been alarming in the boat, it became truly threatening when they had come aboard. They lay about the deck growling together in talk. The slightest order was received with a black look and grudgingly and carelessly obeyed. Even the honest hands must have caught the infection, for there was not one man aboard to mend another. Mutiny, it was plain, hung over us like a thundercloud, and it was not only we of the cabin party who perceived the danger. Long John was hard at work, going from group to group, spending himself in good advice, and as, for example, no man could have shown a better, he fairly outstripped himself in willingness and civility. He was all smiles to everyone. If an order was given, John would be on his couch in an instant, with the cheeriest "Aye, aye, sir" in the world, and when there was nothing else to do, he kept up one song after another, as if to conceal the discontent of the rest. Of all the gloomy features of that gloomy afternoon, this obvious anxiety on the part of Long John appeared the worst. We held a council in the cabin. "Sir," said the captain, "if I risk another order, the whole ship'll come about our ears by the run. You see, sir, here it is." I get a rough answer. Do I not? Well, if I speak back, pikes will be going in 2 shakes. If I don't, Silver will see there's something under that, and the game's up. Now we've only one man to rely on. "And who's that?" asked the squire. "Silver, sir," returned the captain. "He isn't as anxious as you and I to smother things up. This was a tiff. He'd soon talk 'em out of it if he had the chance. And I propose to do is give him the chance. Let's allow the men an afternoon ashore. If they all go, we'll fight the ship. If none of them go, well then we hold the cabin, and God defend the rights. If some go, you mark my words, sir, Silver'll bring 'em aboard, again as mild as lambs. It was so decided. Loaded pistols were served out to all the shore men. Hunter, Joyce, and Rudolph were taken into our confidence and received the news with less surprise and a better spirit than we had looked for. And then the captain went on deck and addressed the crew. "My lads," said he, "we've had a hot day and are tired and out of sorts. A turn ashore'll hurt nobody. The boats are still in the water. You can take the gigs, and as many as please may go ashore for the afternoon. I'll fire a gun half an hour before the sundown." I believe the silly fellows must have thought they would break their shins over treasure as soon as they were landed, for they all came out of their sulks in the moment and gave a cheer that started the echo in a faraway hill and sent the birds once more flying and squalling round the anchorage. The captain was too bright to be in the way. He whipped out of sight in a moment, leaving Silver to arrange the party, and I fancy it was as well he did so. Had he been on deck, he could no longer so much as have pretended not to understand the situation. It was plain as day. Silver was the captain, and a rebellious crew he had of it. The honest hands, and I was soon to see it proved that there were such on board, must have been very stupid fellows. Or rather, I suppose the truth was this, that all hands were disaffected by the example of the ringleaders. Only some more, some less, and a few, being good fellows in the main, could neither be led nor driven any further. It was one thing to be idle and sulk, and quite another to take a ship and murder a number of innocent men. At last, however, the party was made up. 6 fellows were to stay on board, and the remaining 13, including Silver, began to embark. Then it was there came into my head the first of the mad notions that contributed so much to save our lives. If 6 men were left by Silver, it was plain our party could not take and fight the ship. And since only 6 were left, it was equally plain that the cabin party had no present need of my assistance. It occurred to me at once to go ashore. In a jiffy, I had slipped over the side and curled up in the fore sheets of the nearest boat, and almost at the same moment she shoved off. No one took notice of me, only the bow oar saying, "Is that you, Kim? Keep your head down." But Silver, from the other boat, looked sharply over and called out to know if that were me. And from that moment I began to regret what I had done. The crews raced for the beach, but the boat I was in, having some start and being at once the lighter and the better manned, shot far ahead of her consort, and the bow had struck among the shoreside trees, and I had caught a branch and swung myself out and plunged into the nearest thicket, while Silver and the rest were still 100 yards behind. "Jim, Jim," I heard him shouting, but you may suppose I paid no heed. Jumping, ducking, and breaking though, I ran straight before my nose till I could run no longer. Chapter 14. The First Blow. I was so pleased at having given the slip to Long John that I began to enjoy myself and look around me with some interest on the strange land that I was in. I had crossed a marshy track full of willows, bulrushes, and odd, outlandish swampy trees, and I had now come out upon the skirts of an open piece of undulating sandy country, about a mile long, dotted with a few pines and a great number of contorted trees, not unlike the oak in growth, but pale in foliage, like willows. On the far side of the open stood one of the hills, with two quaint craggy peaks shining vividly in the sun. Hills with two quaint craggy peaks shining vividly in the sun. I now felt for the first time the joy of exploration. The isle was uninhabited. My shipmates I had left behind, and nothing lived in front of me but dumb brutes and fowls. I turned hither and thither among the trees. Here and there were flowering plants, unknown to me. Here and there I saw snakes, and one raised his head from a ledge of a rock and hissed at me with a noise not unlike the spinning of a top. Little did I suppose he was a deadly enemy, and that noise was the famous rattle. Then I came to a long thicket of these oak-like trees, live or evergreen oaks. I heard afterwards they should be called, which grew low along the sand like branches, like brambles. The boughs curiously twisted, the foliage compact like thatch. The thicket stretched down from the top of one of the shady knolls, spreading and growing taller as it went, until it reached the margin of the broad, reedy fen, through which the nearest of the little rivers soaked its way into the anchorage. The marsh was steaming in the sun strong, and the outline of the spyglass trembled through the haze. All at once there began to go a sort of bustle among the bulrushes. A wild duck flew up with a quack, another followed, and soon over the whole surface of the marsh a great cloud of birds hung screaming and circling in the air. I judged at once that some of my shipmates must be drawing near along the borders of the fen, nor was I deceived, for soon I heard the very distant and low tones of a human voice, which, as I continued to give ears, grew steadily louder and nearer. This put me in a great fear, as I crawled under cover of the nearest live oak and squatted there, hearkening as silent as a mouse. Another voice answered, and then the first voice, which I recognized to be Silver's, once more took up the story and ran on for a long while in a stream, only now and again interrupted by another. By the sound they must have been talking earnestly and almost fiercely, but no distinct word came to my hearing. At last the speakers seemed to have paused, and perhaps to have sat down, for not only did they cease to draw nearer, but the birds themselves began to grow more quiet and settle again to their places in the swamp. And now I began to feel that I was neglecting my business, and since I had been so foolhardily as to come ashore with these desperadoes, the least I could do was overhear them at their council, and that my plain and obvious duty was to draw as close as I could manage, under the favorable ambush of the crouching trees. I could tell the direction of the speakers pretty exactly, not only by the sound of their voices, but by the behavior of the few birds that still hung in alarm above the heads of the intruders. Crawling on all fours, I made steadily but slowly towards them. till at last, raising my head to an aperture among the leaves, I could see clear down into the little green dell beside the marsh, and closely set out about with the trees, where Long John Silver and another of the crew stood face to face in conversation. The sun beat full upon them. Silver had thrown his hat beside him on the ground, and his great smooth blond face, all shining with heat, was lifted to the other man's in the kind of appeal. Mates, he was saying, it's because I think gold dust of you. Gold dust, and you may lay to that. If I hadn't took to you like a pitch, do you think have been here a warning to you? All's up. You can't make nor mend. It's to save your neck that I am speaking. And if one of the wild uns knew it, where'd I be? Tom, now tell me, where'd I be? Silver, said the other man, and I observed he was not only red in the face, but spoke as hoarse as a crow, and his voice shook too, like a taut rope. Silver, says he, you're old and you're honest, or has the name for it, and you've money too, which lots of poor sailors hasn't, and you're brave, or I mistook, and you will tell me you'll let yourself be led away that kind of a mess of swabs, not you. As sure as God sees me, I'd sooner lose my hand if I turn again my duty. And then all of a sudden he was interrupted by a noise. I had found one of the honest hands. Well, there. At the same moment came news of another. Far away out in the marsh there arose all of a sudden a sound like a cry of anger, then another on the back of it, and then one horrid long-drawn scream. The rocks of the spyglass re-echoed it a score of times, and the whole troop of marsh birds rose again, darkening heaven with a simultaneous whir. And long after that deaf yell was still ringing in my brain, silence had re-established its empire, and only the rustle of the re-descending birds and the boom of the distant surges disturbed the languor of the afternoon. Tom had leapt at the sound, like a horse at the spur. But Silver had not winked an eye. He stood where he was, resting lightly on his crutch, watching his companion like a snake about to spring. John, said the sailor, stretching out his hands. Hands off, cried Silver, leaping back a yard, as it seemed to me, with the speed and security of a trained gymnast. Hands off, if you like, John Silver, said the other. It's a black conscience that can make you feared of me. But in heaven's name, tell me, what was that? That, returned Silver, smiling away, but warier than ever, his eye a mere pinpoint in his big face, but gleaming like a crumb of glass. That? Oh, I reckon thou be Allen. And at this point, Tom flashed out like a hero. Allen, he cried, then rest his soul for a true seaman. And as for you, John Silver, long you've been a mate of mine, but you're mate of mine no more. If I die like a dog, I'll die in my duty. You've killed Allen, have you? Kill me too, if you can, but I defies you. And with that, this brave fellow turned his back directly on the cook and set off walking for the beach. But he was not destined to go far. With a cry, John seized the branch of a tree, whipped the crutch out of his armpit, and sent that uncouth missile hurtling through the air, and it struck poor Tom, point foremost, with stunning violence, right between the shoulders, in the middle of his back. His hands flew up. He gave a sort of gasp and fell. Whether he were injured much or little, none could ever tell. Like enough to judge from the sound, his back was broken on the spot, but he had no time given him to recover. Silver, agile as a monkey, even without leg or crutch, was on top of him next moment and had twice buried his knife up to the hilt in that defenseless body. From my place of ambush, I could hear him plant aloud as he struck the blows. I do not know what it is rightly what it rightly is to faint, but I do know that for the next little while the whole world swam away from before me in a whirling mist, Silver and the birds, and the tall spyglass hilltop, going around and round and topsy-turvy before my eyes, and all manner of bells ringing and distant voices shouting in my ear. When I came again to myself, the monster had pulled himself together, his crutch under his arm, his hat upon his head. Just before him, Tom laid motionless upon the sward. But the murderer minded him not a whit, cleansing his blood-stained knife, and while upon a wisp of grass, everything else was unchanged. The sun still shining mercilessly on the steaming marsh and the tall pinnacle of the mountain. And I could scarce persuade myself that murder had been actually done and a human life cruelly cut short a moment though since before my eyes. But now John put his hand into his pocket, brought out a whistle, and blew upon it several modulated blasts that rang far across the heated air. I could not tell, of course, the meaning of the signal, but it instantly awoke my fears. More men would be coming. I might be discovered. They had already slain 2 of the honest people after Tom and Allen. Might not I come next? Instantly I began to extricate myself and crawl back again, with what speed and silence I could manage, to the more open portion of the wood. As I did so, I could hear nails coming and going between the old buccaneer and his comrades, and this sound of danger lent me wings. As soon as I was clear of the thicket, I ran as I never ran before, scarce minding the direction of my flight, so long as it led me from the murderers, and as I ran, fear grew and grew upon me until it turned into a kind of frenzy. Indeed, could anyone be more entirely lost than I? When the gun fired, how should I dare to go down to the boats among those fiends still smoking from their crime? Would not the first of them who saw me wring my neck like a snipe's? Would not my absence itself be an evidence to them of my alarm, and therefore my fatal knowledge? It was all over, I thought. Goodbye to the Hispaniola, goodbye to the squire, the doctor, and the captain. There was nothing left for me but death by starvation or death by the hands of the mutineers. All this while, as I say, I was running, and without taking any notice, I was drawn near to the foot of the hill, the little hill with the 2 peaks, and had got into a part of the island where the live oaks grew more widely upon and seemed more like forest trees in their bearing and dimension. Mingled with these were a few scattered pines, some 50, some nearer 70 feet high. The air too smelt more freshly than down besides the marsh. And here a fresh alarm brought me to a standstill with a thumping heart. And that concludes chapter 14 of Treasure Island.